For years, many who were once Protestant have been turning to the Catholic Church and returning to the Catholic Church religion, leaving aside sola scriptura, leaving aside the Christianity that is known all over the world, to go back to a religion that holds to its own traditions and that teaches that only they are the true religion.
The fathers of the church are different. First of all, they're called fathers because they helped bring Christianity out of its diapers into adulthood. And therefore, they come from a very particular era, the early centuries of the church. And no one can ever play the role that they played once again. They were the teachers, and the teachers who wrote down their teaching so that they could give this teaching to subsequent generations. Early teachers from about the year 100 to about the year 800. And they left their writings for us, and in their writings we find that they passed on the early Christian tradition of doctrine, and they helped to clarify that tradition going back to the apostles.
Now, last time that I did this program solo, I focused on a topic that I called the verses I never saw. And in other words, I addressed those key scriptures that opened my heart to the Catholic Church. I had been a Protestant for 40 years, a pastor for 10 of those, and loved the scriptures, believed in sola scriptura, but through the witness of a good old seminary friend named Scott Hahn and others, I began to see that there were scripture texts that I didn't seem to see before. They were there, but either I jumped over them or ignored them, but just didn't recognize the importance of what they said. And then through the 10 verses that I mentioned on that program and others, my heart was opened to the truth of the Catholic faith. And those of you interested can go to the EWTN website, or you can go to the Coming Home Network website, chnetwork.org, and you can get those 10 verses in case you didn't get them before. But as I thought about what I'd like to cover tonight, I thought I'd have us look at the early church fathers that I never saw. If you've been a viewer of the Journey Home program for the last 9 or so years, you've heard many, many times that our guests have said that it was through the reading of the early church fathers that their hearts and minds were open to the truth of the Catholic faith. And that was true for me too. And I thought to continue that flow from that last program, I'd give you some quotes from the early church fathers. We entered last week into, for many Christians, unknown territory, beyond Scripture into the Didache, into the other writings of the early church. And what I'd like us today is to kind of do an end run. We're going to start with the Didache, work our way through a couple other writings of the early church fathers, back to Scripture, but focusing on this issue of the Eucharist. Before we do that again, though, Ken, talk from your own experience as a scholar, Scripture scholar, how indeed it was the witness of the early church fathers that opened your mind and heart to the beauty of the Eucharist.
Well, it was clear to me that as I began reading the earliest church fathers, the Didache, Justin Martyr, Ignatius of Antioch, that first of all, the Eucharist was called by that term, meaning not just thanksgiving, but it seems to have been a technical term to refer to the sacrament. And that was something different than was true in my experience as a Presbyterian, or in most Protestant experiences that I knew of. On the other hand, I was also impressed by how central it was in their thinking, and especially in their worship. At the time in which I began reading them, I began thinking about the question of what constitutes proper Christian worship. How do we know how to have a worship service? Should it be just preaching? Should it be preaching in hymns? What should it be? And it was very clear in reading these early church fathers, especially the Didache, that the Eucharist was very central to the liturgical life of the early church. And so I asked myself the question, well, why didn't I see that in Scripture before, if it's true? And the fact is, I think it is in Scripture, but it's just that I missed it. It's one of those verses I never saw, so to speak, because my eyes were not open to seeing it. But once I saw this in the early church fathers, it was unmistakably clear to me that there was a continuity between the times of the New Testament and these earliest writers.
You know, Ken,
thing that made me to consider the Catholic Church is a classic Protestant seminary mistake is they had me read the early church fathers. And when you read Ignatius of Antioch and you read Irenaeus of Lyon and so many others, and you realize that they knew the guy that knew the guy, Jesus Christ, you start the mind reels about the ramifications of what that means. If you grow up in the Catholic Church as not even a real consideration, or it's far away from your mind, to have things like bishops be within 100 years of the scriptures and the apostles makes you radically reconsider everything you thought of beforehand. And that really was the moment, those first few weeks of seminary, where I came face to face with the idea that the Catholic Church may be true.
Now, this is the thing. Many Protestants through the years have made videos where they turn or go back to the Catholic religion. And one of the number one reasons that they do this is because they say they read the Ante-Nicene Fathers, the writings of the Ante-Nicene Fathers, and found the church to be Catholic, so they came back to the Catholic Church. But what they ignorantly do not know is that the writings of the Ante-Nicene Fathers are very questionable. And there is so many things wrong with the writings of the Ante-Nicene Fathers that to put your faith on that alone and leave the Bible behind and go to a religion that holds to its own traditions is suicidal. These men, women who claim to be intelligent really lack tremendous intelligence. They, in my estimation, they're gambling with their souls. And when they're doing this, they do it because of writings that are so spurious. Some of them are forgeries. And they have been interpolated throughout. And so we don't know if they're the original or somebody just faked them. We don't know. I suspect the Catholic Church has a lot to do with all of this. But nonetheless, questionable. These men, women who say they return to the Catholic Church because of the Ante-Nicene Fathers do not understand that the writings of the Ante-Nicene Fathers hold many fables and myths. One of them is the phoenix bird, which lives 500 years. And the incredible thing that this is taught not only with Clement of Rome in the 1st and 2nd century, but it goes all the way to Tertullian in the 3rd century. And then it surpasses that with Lactantius and the Apostolic Constitutions, which also teach the same thing. So throughout the first early Apostolic Fathers and Ante-Nicene Fathers, the teaching of the Phoenix is there. This points to the Fathers as being those who the apostles warned us about. It says that after their departure, men would come in and they would teach fables. And this is exactly what the Ante-Nicene Fathers were doing. So when the Protestants leave the Protestant movement to go to the Catholic Church because of the writings of the Ante-Nicene Fathers, they do not know what they're doing. They are being so ignorant to not have studied and researched the writings of the Apostolic and Ante-Nicene Fathers. We have done it, and we are alarmed that people are so ignorant to leave their denomination to go into a religion that does not hold to sola scriptura, a religion that has a horrible history of persecution of innocent people.
What exactly is a phoenix? For the ancient Greeks, the phoenix was a bird that was capable of regenerating itself. Legend has it that it would spontaneously combust when it was ready to die, and from the ashes of the old bird would emerge a fresh hatchling. Then the cycle would continue. On the other hand, the ancient Egyptians associated the phoenix with the sun. They claimed that the hatchling would fly with the ashes of its predecessor to Heliopolis, or the city of the sun, where it would lay them down as an offering on the altar of the god of the sun, Re. According to another of their folk stories, though, the dying phoenix itself would come to Heliopolis before bursting into flames in the temple. These mythologies may vary slightly, however it's clear that classical antiquity links the phoenix with immortality. Over time, this representation would be adopted by entire civilizations and even world religions. For instance, the bird was engraved on the coinage of the Roman Empire, symbolizing its might and permanence. Christians would also take the phoenix as an allegory of resurrection, rebirth, and the afterlife, which were ideas that appealed to their core beliefs. For Muslims, though, it was identified with the Anka, which was a massive bird created by God without any flaws, but eventually morphed into a plague and was killed. The phoenix can also be seen in other cultures, which was a bird often depicted with fireballs. In Slavic folklore, the firebird could emit light, and was frequently the object of a difficult quest, with the hero setting out to capture it in a bid to please either the king or his father. This mirrors the Ibang Adarna of the Philippines, which was a 16th century epic poem that revolved around three sibling princes attempting to seize the bird in order to use its magical tears to heal their ailing father. Now, what did the phoenix look like? One of the original depictions of the phoenix comes from the father of history, Herodotus, an ancient Greek historian famous for his magnum opus, the Histories. He wrote the following passage in the 5th century BC. The Egyptians have also another sacred bird called the phoenix, which I myself have never seen except in pictures. Indeed, it is a great rarity, even in Egypt, only coming there, according to the accounts of the people of Heliopolis, once in 500 years when the old phoenix dies. Its size and appearance, if it is like the pictures, are as follow. The plumage is partly red, partly golden, while the general make and size are almost exactly that of an eagle. Our modern conception of the phoenix mostly comes from the account that Herodotus wrote. The images of the bird that we have in films, shows, and books today are all roughly the same, an awe-inspiring animal with glorious red and gold feathers, often as big as an eagle.
The first Epistle of Clement. Let us consider that wonderful sign of the resurrection, which takes place in eastern lands, that is, in Arabia and the countries round about. There is a certain bird which is called a phoenix. This is the only one of its kind and lives 500 years. And when the time of its dissolution draws near, that it must die, it builds itself a nest of frankincense and myrrh and other spices, into which, when the time is fulfilled, it enters and dies. But as the flesh decays, a certain kind of worm is produced, which, being nourished by the juices of the dead bird, brings forth feathers. Then, when it has acquired strength, it takes up the nest in which are the bones of its parents, and bearing these, it passes from the land of Arabia into Egypt to the city called Heliopolis, and in open day, flying in the sight of all men, it places them on the altar of the sun, and having done this, hastens back to its former abode. The priests then inspect the registers of the dates and find that it has returned exactly as the 500th year was completed. Tertullian on the resurrection of the flesh. I refer to the subject alike to life and death. I refer to the bird, which is peculiar to the East, famous for its singularity, marvelous from its humanous life, which renews its life in a voluntary death. Its dying day is its birthday, and on it departs and returns. Once more, a phoenix, where just now there was none. Once more himself, but just now out of existence. Another, yet the same. Lactantius. This grove, these woods, a single bird, the phoenix, inhabits. And then it tells us about the phoenix. It says, and these ashes collected in death it fuses, as it were into a mass, and has an effect resembling seed. From this an animal is said to arise without limbs, but the worm is said to be a milky color. and it suddenly increases vastly with an imperfectly formed body and collects itself into the appearance of a well-rounded egg. After this it is formed again, such as its figure was before, and the phoenix, having burst her shell, shoots forth, even as the caterpillars in the fields when they are fastened by a thread to a stone, and goes on and on and on. She shows and represents herself as an object of admiration to the beholder. Such great beauty is there, such great honor abounds. And it keeps going on the phoenix bird. The apostolic constitutions are the constitutions of the holy apostles. It says, they call it a phoenix and relate that every 500 years it comes into Egypt to that which is called the altar of the sun, and brings with it a great quantity of cinnamon and cassius and balsamic wood, and standing towards the east, as they say, and praying to the sun. Listen to that. Praying to the sun. Of its own accord is burned and becomes dust. But that a worm arises again out of those ashes, and that when the same is warmed, it is formed into a newborn phoenix. And when it is able to fly, it goes to Arabia, which is beyond the Egyptian countries.